and Cleo here, and today we're doing a book tag. I don't do book tags all that often. I really should do them more often. I kind of always feel like I'm falling back to the same book, but if I prepare them well enough in advance, I can hopefully make sure that I'm talking about different books when I do book tag videos. So I kind of like doing that. It's a nice way to talk about books that don't necessarily have a lot in common with each other, or talk about books that you haven't talked about in a very long time. It's a nice way to get to talk about those types of books more regularly, for example. But so, today we are doing the Contradictions Book Tag. I was tagged to do this tag by the original creator, which is Daniela from Only If For a Page. I'm always hesitating about the order of that channel name, but so Only If For a Page. Daniela is an international booktuber as well, so I would highly recommend you check her out, as I always think that, more perspectives add more recommendations, add different type of books for you to explore, for you to discover. And I really love watching her videos. I definitely love her unhaul book videos, which she does a lot, and she also very much loves unhaul videos as well. Now, for today's tag, this is a very interesting tag in my opinion. So the Contradictions Book Tag is all about looking at the contradictions in our reading taste. We might say this and that is our favorite genre, but within those genres there will always be books that we don't like, for example. And so this book tag is all about those sort of contradictions between things we like, but then certain examples of that we don't end up liking, and vice versa. So without further ado, let's dive into the video. Let's take a look at these specific questions. First question: I love this genre, but I didn't like this book. So for this question, I have multiple genres that I really like. I really like, sort of like general fiction, let's call it. So basically sort of like literary fiction, the type of fiction that doesn't easily qualify itself into a genre. And this is sort of more like deep stuff, the slower stuff, the more boring stuff, let's say it like that. Aside from that, I really love magical realism, and of course I really love fantasy. Fantasy is like the genre that got me into reading. It's what I've been reading since I've been a reader, so since I was 11. That is kind of the genre that is a standard in my reading life. That's the one that was there from day one, let's say. And so for fantasy, I'm going to mention a book that I absolutely despise, though it can also be considered somewhat of a guilty pleasure read, and that will be A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I've recently seen it popping up again, like here and there. It's not like an overwhelming hype or anything like that, but I think Reagan from Peruse Project was the one I saw pick it up again first recently, and then I've seen a couple of other people also been picking it up now, which, it's a book that's been out for a while. Of course there's a new TV show, so maybe that's also the reason why people are watching it, but so yeah, I've seen multiple people pick it up now, and the majority of them like it, and I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get why we like that book. So A Discovery of Witches is basically Twilight, but with academia. So basically we have a young innocent woman falling in love with, dark brooding vampire, and, losing all sense of her personality, and, just becoming a submissive basically to him. That's basically what this is. So our protagonist, Diana, is, I say young, but it's not like a teenager, she is like, let's say, mid-20s, late 20s or something like that, because she is in academia and she's trying to become a sort of like professor. So she's currently returning to Oxford, England, where she did her studies, and she's hoping to become a permanent teacher there. And so while she's doing research for her new paper, she comes across a book, a rare manuscript, and when she touches it, there is a reaction. The book reacts, and the people around her, or at least the supernatural people around her, so the vampires and the demons, they take note. So this turns out to be a manuscript that nobody has been able to locate for centuries. And so as a result, Diana becomes a very important player within the Oxford supernatural scene, and multiple people approach her to, have her hand over the book. One of them is Matthew, a vampire who has been looking for the manuscript for centuries, and as you can imagine, a romance ensues. Now, what I absolutely hate about this book is that Diana at the beginning is painted as this sort of like young independent woman. She has a career path in mind, she knows what she wants and she's willing to go for it. And then as the book progresses, she starts to give in more and more to his alpha male behavior, and so his need to protect her, and she goes along with that, whereas before she was somebody who, you know, tackles her own problems and things like that. And I felt like she was losing all of that independence. All the reasons why I love this sort of strong independent protagonist at the beginning, they just kind of left, and I felt became like, I love Matthew, and that's all that I am. So yeah, didn't love that. Then what I also don't like is Diana is actually a witch. So she has magical powers, but she has never really manifested them, and she's never really wanted to be trained in them. She's always felt like she didn't want to dive into that world because her parents, who were also witches, were killed for being witches. And so she doesn't have magical powers, doesn't have magical training, but throughout this book it turns out that she has like access to 20,000 magical powers, and even though she doesn't really know how to use them, if she would be like basically like a god in this world. She could do whatever she wants because she would have like power over almost every single thing that you can have power over. So don't like that neither. And so there weren't a whole lot of redeeming things about this. It also has like a horrible yoga scene that I just always associate with this particular book, but it is also a little bit of a guilty pleasure read because I did want to see where this romance was going to go. I did want to see how this story was going to continue, and so part of me really had to debate whether I wanted to continue, but then I really just had to tell myself, like, you hate read through this entire book, and so even though I kind of want to see how the plot develops, I don't want to spend all of those pages with such a negative mindset, so there's no reason for me to continue. I have since tried to start the second season of the TV show, which is the second book, and I watched one episode and I was not interested, so I've clearly been like, okay, I clearly made the right decision, I don't want to continue with this one, and yeah, no, not for me. Second one, I rarely read this genre, but I love this book. I do have a book for that. And funnily enough, I won't be able to talk about it much because I don't remember much. But so I'm going to talk about crime. So I don't really like crime stories at all, basically. I mean, the few cases that I've read, I've either DNF'd halfway through or I've like had to struggle through it. So it's really not a genre that I like. Even in TV shows or in movies, for example, like it needs to have something else for me to latch onto, because this pure story of the crime and like figuring out who did it, and that doesn't interest me at all. But what I did very much like was His Bloody Project by Gray McRae Burnett. This was a nominee for the Booker Prize in 2016, and I don't really remember why I liked this one. I think this is also a lot more of a courtroom drama than the crime story itself, and I think it was possibly also had like documents in it, but if I'm looking through it now, I don't see that at all. But that's basically like my one example. The problem is that I don't dislike enough of genres. I have a pretty open mind when it comes to genres. The only thing that I can actively think of that I dislike is detective style stories, and this is probably the only example of one that I really enjoyed without going into a mix with another genre, such as with fantasy, for example. So I wanted to give a pure sort of like crime story, and this is the closest thing that I got to. So I really absolutely love this one, and I've definitely been like eager to reread it just to see why I loved it, because I remember loving it, but I cannot, like, I have no real understanding anymore of what the story was about. I think it's a murder taking place in the Highlands in Scotland, and then you know, the trial that ensues, but I really don't know anything anymore about why it is that I then really loved this one, because it doesn't sound like something that I would like. Third one, and I really have to, like, I'm really gonna have to keep myself from rambling about this one, but I love this trope, but I don't like this book. And the trope is the underdog. I really love underdog stories. I love rooting for a character that, you know, nobody believes in and that everybody is setting up for failure, and then seeing them rise above the challenge, seeing them get to where they want to get. Love that trope, absolutely. What I don't like it in is in The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And let me tell you, the underdog trope is the one reason why I actually liked this book and finished it at first. So I think the first 200 pages or something, the underdog element to this story is what got me thinking that I was gonna like this book, is what got me like excited for it. I was all ready to be down with this protagonist to, you know, watch him prove everybody wrong, because He's basically a college dropout. He basically was doing architectural studies, and you know, his designs are so advanced and so out of the ordinary that his teachers don't agree with his visions, and they kind of wanted him to compromise. You know, they want to have him compromise his vision so that it falls in line more with the sort of like classical styles that they are teaching. But he is somebody who is unwilling to compromise. You know, he has a vision, he has a passion for what he's doing. He sees things going in a certain direction, and he knows that that is the direction things should be going in, and so he doesn't want to compromise. And then he ends up dropping out of college, and so he wants to set up in his own place. And so he meets this sort of this sort of idol of his who has this sort of like same sort of controversial building style, and he kind of becomes his protege. So I was like, okay, down for it. Give me a story of this guy proving everybody wrong, and you know, doing his thing and proving that, you know, you shouldn't, you know, compromise your vision. Your artistic integrity is super important. But by the end of this book, I was no longer convinced that I agree with that vision, because this is such a horrible character, and I totally dislike this character. And you know, whereas first I was like happy that he never compromises his vision, throughout the book I just started to, yeah, he irked me so much after a while, because he has like no people skills, but I also don't have a lot of people skills, so I'm still not entirely sure anymore what put me off him. But what I definitely didn't like is that it also has a toxic relationship. So there's a relationship with this sort of mysterious woman, and there's this sort of like very much a push and pull between them. She kind of becomes famous as a sort of critic of his work, and so she really bashes his work, but secretly she very much looks up to his work. She very much recognizes that his work is the real deal, but she's constantly working against him because she doesn't want to see him succeed, I guess. And he knows that she's doing that, and he recognizes what she's doing, but still he, you know, is, you know, he just shoves that under the rug. That's not important to him. And there are so many characters within this book who recognize the genius of what he's doing, but then work against him, kind of actively work against him getting successful. So when he is starting to build a reputation at some point, some critic who absolutely recognizes that what he's doing is brilliant then constantly shuts him down and writes horrible reviews about him, because he believes that people should follow the mainstream, should be part of the mass, and that collectivism is like the most important thing. And so, yeah, let's stop there. I didn't like it, and I know very few people who like it. Question number 4 is the opposite. I hate this trope, but I love this book. And for this one, I don't have an answer. I don't actively hate tropes, because I think most tropes can be done well. And it's just a question of them being handled a little bit lazily. I cannot even say that I absolutely hate love triangles. I just hate the way that they're usually done. And I don't think I have great examples of how they're done better without them going into, for example, polyamory, which, yes, I love it, but I'm not entirely sure I can classify it as a love triangle anymore in that case. So I'm gonna go with just explaining a trope that I dislike, but I won't be able to give you an example of when I do like it, because that will be major spoilers. So what I absolutely dislike in books, what can really ruin a book just by being there. A love triangle I can still get over, but this trope is a lot more difficult for me, and that is the resurrection trope. If you are going to kill off a character, if you're bringing back that character, there's so many chances are high that I'm going to be like, yeah, that's it, done with this book. I might continue it, I might still like parts of it, but you know, that trope has a huge impact on my enjoyment of it. I used to like it, but it was done so many times that I was just absolutely not liking it anymore. It's really gotten to the extent, and a whole lot of readers have that, where if you don't see a body, you're just assuming that this character is going to come back. And I don't know, I think it's manipulative. Stop playing with our emotions like that. And aside from that, it just like lowers stakes for books in general. The idea that, you know, they'll come back, you know. At this point in time, you barely trust it anymore when somebody dies that they will stay dead. It's definitely been changing over the past few years, but so I really dislike this resurrection trope. But on occasion, it is done correctly. on occasion the way in which it's done makes sense. The way in which it's done is maybe referenced to or, you know, built up from the beginning, way before the actual death took place. There were already hints and pieces put in place to build up to this resurrection. In those cases, I can enjoy it. Next up, I love this author but I hate this book, and we are going to have to go with one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson. So I really love Brandon Sanderson. Like, the first series that I absolutely adored was, you know, aside from Harry Potter, was Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. When I read Mistborn, I was just like in love with it. It just blew my mind the way in which that series was plotted, and, you know, the action in it, the magic system, all of those things. I just thought it had so many elements that I was in awe with. So Brandon Sanderson has definitely been an author that I've really loved throughout the years. I originally only read The Final Empire, then it took me like a few years to reread that one and continue on with the series. And it wasn't actually until I joined BookTube that I actually thought about reading more by Brandon Sanderson and reading more of his fantasy works, or that I actually found out about more of his fantasy works. And so since then I've been catching up. And so one of the series, kind of novella series, that I started with at some point was Legion. Now this is detective style novella by Brandon Sanderson, and this is another case in point of the fact that I don't like detective style stories. There is a sort of speculative aspect to this, in the sense that the main character in Legion has a sort of like multiple personality disorder, you could say, where he basically has these different persona that he sees as separate people that will then be specialized in certain skill sets, for example. So if he needs to learn a language, for example, a new persona will develop itself, and that person will be like a translator of that particular language or something like that. So when he needs to use that language, that persona is helping him speak that language. So I thought that that aspect was very interesting, but that's all I liked about it, because aside from that, it was just all about some sort of a case, and yeah, I don't like those types of plots. So, sorry, Brandon. And then I also don't really have an answer for the next one, or not a real correct answer, which is I previously disliked the book by this author, but I love this book. And so I didn't dislike this book, but I had previously read a book by this author, and I really didn't know what to think of my experience with that. Did I like it? Did I understand anything? I think it was somewhat of a struggle for me to get through, and I think mainly because it went over my head completely, but there was also something that intrigued me about it. There was something about it that did work. And so I did try another book by this author, and I love this book. This is my favorite book of 2021 so far, I think. I'm not gonna fully say that for sure, but it's a high contender, and that is Human Acts by Han Kang. So I previously read The Vegetarian. The Vegetarian is the book that is most famous by Han Kang, and so it's a book that I see multiple people pick up on BookTube. I've actually recently seen a couple of people pick it up again, so it's going through another sort of like wave on BookTube, I guess. And it's very weird. A lot of people don't really know what their opinion about it is, or they really love it. Human Acts is quite different, but you can definitely recognize that it's the same author because it has that same sort of like visceral style to it. It is brutal in its writing, the way that The Vegetarian often is as well. And so there are a lot of triggers when it comes to this one as well. But this is based on real events, and it isn't really a cohesive story neither, to some extent. This is the story of the Gwangju uprising that took place in South Korea in 1980. This is an uprising mainly of the student body, but I think also of like local laborers, of factory workers and things like that. And this was heavily beaten down by the army of South Korea at the time. And so this story will see us following multiple people with a connection to that event. Like, I think the first half of it mainly sees us following people who were there during the uprising, and so we are following them during the uprising itself. And so we're watching events unfold through their eyes. We're watching the uprising itself, but we're also, for example, watching them in these sort of like prison camps afterwards. But towards the end of the novel, we're also watching perspectives of people, decades afterwards, who are trying to bring these events to light, but who are struggling with censorship and things like that. This is told brutally, viscerally. You will have scenes that are super difficult to digest. So in that opening chapter, we already get very vivid, visceral descriptions of corpses, for example, and that happens multiple times throughout this book. And, you know, when it comes to the prison camps, for example, there are also a whole lot of triggers there when it comes to torture, to sexual violence. So throughout this book, there are huge amount of triggers. But it is also a real page in history. These are real events that have taken place. And even though there isn't really a cohesive story or anything like that, I was so gripped. I finished this book in like a few hours, I think. It is also quite short as well, so that also helps, of course, with finishing it quite quickly. But I also just really wanted to know more. I wanted to keep on going, wanted to continue, because I wanted to know what else took place then, what other atrocious events took place at that point in time. But so highly recommend this book. 7th question, basically like cover by gone wrong. I hate this book, and it's not a question of actually hating this book. Maybe I have examples of hating books but loving the covers, but this is like the best example I can give you of like, this cover is to die for, and I bought the book because of the cover and then being completely disappointed by it. So the book that I'm going to talk about is The Binding by Bridget Collins. You definitely will see people who have a different opinion about this than I do. But so The Binding by Bridget Collins has a stunning cover. Every book by Bridget Collins has a stunning cover. I've seen her newer book, The Betrayals, I think, has a gorgeous cover. But also for The Betrayals, I know that Sarah from Voyaging Worlds, for example, she also kind of bought it for the cover and then absolutely disliked the book. Now the premise for this sound is super interesting, but I almost don't want to give it because it is a spoiler to some extent, because the event that takes place in that premise like only takes place after like a third of the novel or something, and that first third of the novel you're building up to him figuring out something that is explained in the premise immediately. So I mean, I cannot talk about it. And then the one thing that I think shouldn't be a spoiler, but is now being treated as a spoiler because it's not in that premise, is that this is a male-male romance. So that is of course part of what is being revealed throughout this book, but I will say that I think that sexuality, sexual orientation should never be a spoiler. It is a big enough struggle to find queer stories, and so I definitely don't think that we should be hiding this aspect of a book. And so that's the best part of this book. I love the queer romance. So the second part of this book very much dives into the development of this male-male romance, and I loved that part. I thought it was beautifully done. It was really a sort of like, you know, opposites attract, or, you know, reluctant attraction. You know, it's like a reluctant romance, and you as a reader already know what is going to happen at the end of that romance. And so, you know, there's a bittersweetness to that romance as well. And I absolutely love that. And then part 3 to me kind of felt like a reset in their relationship. And as a result, at that point, I just started to feel like the author was playing with our emotions. And so I think with different marketing and a different premise, I could have maybe loved this one. I understand why they give the premise that they give, because the premise sells, but that also meant that I found the first 100 pages or so to be such a bore. So I cannot talk much about this book without spoiling anything, and so I won't talk about it anymore here now. But yeah, that one, I hate the book now because of the way that I was misled by that premise or by marketing. And then the final question is, I don't like this cover, but I love this book. And for that, I'm going with Como Agua para Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. I will say that there are beautiful English covers for this. So in English, this is like water for chocolate. In Spanish, I didn't really find a nice cover, or not one that was like readily available to me in any case. In any case, a lot of times, you know, this is generalization, of course, but a lot of times I think Spanish covers aren't as nice. I think it also stems from the fact that for a very long time, you know, they would have more or less like generic covers. French also has this where, you know, all of the books like have a wide spine, for example, and so they look all the same when you see them in bookstores. And so I'm sure that that is definitely a generalization, that a lot of beautiful covers exist, but I think that they are just like less invested in the aesthetics of the book than perhaps the English language market is. Like Water for Chocolate is a story translated from Spanish. It is a Mexican story, and it is a book of magical realism. Now in this one we are following this family, female family basically, and one of the daughters within the family is in love and she wants to marry, but because she is the youngest daughter, she's not allowed to marry. And so her love interest marries her sister. Dick move. But so he marries her sister, and you can imagine that that causes problems because they stay within the same household, for example. So all these people are still living together. So she is still living together with the person that she wanted to marry. So very problematic in that sense, and so obviously a lot of drama ensues as well. But the most sort of like special thing about this book that it is told in recipes. So each chapter is basically sort of a recipe, and you will have sort of a list of ingredients, and then the chapter will kind of be the instructions for making the recipe. But it pretty early on becomes clear that these aren't real recipes because it will have ingredients that don't really make sense, for example, and the recipe instructions clearly become sort of like instructions for life. So these recipes that she is making, because our protagonist within the story will always be making these recipes, those recipes kind of become recipes for life. I absolutely love it when books put food in focus, or when they put food in a central place in the story, and so I think this is one of the best examples that I have of that particular structural element, that particular way of integrating food and literature. That is it for this tag video. The final question is to tag somebody. I'm going to be tagging a few people. I usually just leave it up to everybody to decide for themselves, and so obviously you don't need to take a tag video if you are tagged if you don't want to do it. But because this is a new tag, I definitely want to make sure that I, specifically send it in the way of certain people. So I'm going to be sending this one to Sarah from Voyaging Words, to Connor from Connor's Stompanada, and from Olivia Savannah from Olivia's Catastrophe. So hope you guys will enjoy taking this book tag. I definitely thought it was interesting questions to think through and to kind of look for the sort of like best possible answers for these particular questions. And so hope you guys will enjoy taking this tag video yourselves as well. But so on that note, I'm going to be ending this video. Definitely let me know as well what some of your contradictions are. You don't need to answer every single question, but if you immediately thought of a certain book with one of these questions, definitely let me know down below, and then we can talk about it a little bit further. If you have differing opinions about some of the books that I mentioned here, or if you want to, let me know that you think exactly the same about some of these, then feel free to. I would love to chat to you guys in the comments below. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!